my fellow wizards! Last night we got a pretty interesting patch which included a whole bunch of small tweaks, but mainly added some brand new spells and a new gear pity crafting system, so let's talk about it. The new spells were actually teased last week by KingsIsle with the caption, "Who could possess this knowledge?" So today we can finally see where you can actually train these spells, how they work, and if they're worth your precious training points. To begin, you can head to the fairgrounds in Wizard City and talk to Sabrina GreenStar to see she now has some new spell options available. Previously, Sabrina allowed players to train various individual school shields, but now she also has these school weakness spells starting at level 10. As an added bonus, you do also get to train your native school's weakness for free without having to spend any training points, so it's definitely worth picking up your native school spell if nothing else. Each spell costs 0 pips to cast and applies a negative 35% school-specific weakness on the enemy. Obviously, Balance is the only school left out here because they already have their own version of weakness, which can be learned from Arthur Weathersfield and other Balance teachers starting at level 8, which instead offers negative 25% to all types of damage, though you do also need to train Scarab and Scorpion to get it. I do find it a bit interesting here that Sabrina doesn't offer a Balance school-specific weakness, since we have seen the addition of Balance-specific blades with spell weaving, but as you'll see in a second, Balance does get some other interesting options over at Niles and Krokotopia. Previously, Niles offered the Elemental and Spirit blades and traps for training, but now he also has the Elemental and Spirit weaknesses starting at level 15. Just like the blades and traps, Balance wizards are able to train these new weaknesses for free. They cost 1 pip each to cast, and place 3 negative 30% elemental or spirit school weaknesses on the enemy. And, small aside, but can I just say that it irrationally bothers me that all these spells are called elemental and spirit instead of spiritual? Like, can we stick with the same naming conventions, please? Anyway, how useful are these new weaknesses, really? First off, there's the obvious positive of enemies not being able to remove them as easily as generic weaknesses. If you know an enemy is likely to use a strong attack from a certain school, you could place a school-specific weakness to prevent them from removing it with a weaker off-school spell. Though obviously, spells like Virulent Plague or Bad Juju may still offer the better utility. There are also certain bosses that have cheats, which usually prevent weaknesses being placed on them at all by casting spells like Dark Pact or Sacrifice to remove them, but with a school-specific weakness, you can get around these types of cheats. This is a bit of a niche use, but still a positive to consider. There are also several weaving spells that use weakness gambits for various effects, so I could see the elemental and spirit weaknesses being a bit more useful there because they place multiple weaknesses at once. A couple examples off the top of my head include Boiling Kraken, where you trade weaknesses on the enemy for damage over time effects, Clammy Ghoul, where you trade weaknesses for death blades, Blah the Impaler, where you trade weaknesses for death traps, and Joltergeist, where you trade weaknesses for an incoming death damage aura. However, as you'll notice, a lot of these are Death School spells, and Death already gets a triple weakness in the form of Threefold Fever, which they can train for free from Mortis, though it does cost 2 pips versus 1 for the Elemental and Spirit weaknesses, so that might be a fair trade-off for some people in exchange for a training point. Then there's obviously various Path B spells that also use gambits with weaknesses like Death's Vampire, which trades weaknesses for stronger chromatic weaknesses, Monster Mash, which trades weaknesses for higher damage, and Avenging Fossil to trade weaknesses for power pips. Ice could use Colossus to trade weaknesses for more ice traps. Balance can technically use Scarab to swap various weaknesses, which could be kind of interesting, and Storm gets Kraken in order to exchange weaknesses for heal over times. So I think the main question will be if people find the individual school weaknesses or elemental and spirit weaknesses worth the cost to set up these types of gambits, or if they can accomplish the same effect through other means. The main issue I see here is that in order to get the full benefit from these spells, you'd have to train all of them, which would cost you an eye-watering 7 training points, which are already in shorter supply now that spell weaving has been introduced to the game, though I do have a guide on how to get max training points for those who are interested. At that point, you'd be far better off just training Balance's weakness spell, or just grabbing a few weakness treasure cards from the bazaar or other vendors, which cost 0 training points and are available very early on in the game. I will say the elemental and spirit weaknesses do seem to have a bit more potential use, but I'd still argue they're fairly niche. It remains to be seen if the school weaknesses themselves will also get treasure card versions, but that may be another option down the line. Don't get me wrong, I am glad these spells have been added, especially at lower levels so players can access them early, but I just can't recommend training most of them besides the free one you get for your native school at present. Alright, now let's move on to the new Atavistic gear pity system the devs added. If you remember, new level 60 Atavistic gear got introduced in the Spring 2025 update and added drops to various bosses in Celestia. This gear also competes directly with the likes of Waterworks, Zigzag, Wintertusk, and Dragonspire, and you can check out my full guide on the topic if you want to know the best options for your school. However, when it launched, there was no gear pity option, and since several of the bosses like Mithraea, for instance, take forever to reach in their respective dungeons, this made farming for the gear incredibly tedious. Thankfully, with this patch, you can now craft the Atavistic gear using recipes at the NPC Gearwise in the Celestia base camp. Each recipe costs shells, aquamarine, and shark teeth, which now drop from the same bosses that drop the Atavistic gear. Depending on the gear you want to craft, you also need to have the relevant badges earned by defeating the bosses a certain number of times, very similar to Wallaroo's pity system. And after doing an experimental run of Praetor Mako to find out the badge requirements, I'm very annoyed to say that the minimum requirement is a whopping 45 fights to unlock the badge, which seems a bit unreasonable in my opinion.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
I'm hoping that the amount of runs required for the likes of Mithraea and Big Salgio, who have much longer dungeons, is way less than 45, but maybe someone can confirm in the comments for us. Either way, this has definitely put a damper on the pity system being added, which is a huge bummer. I really think the badge requirements shouldn't be more than like 10 runs max for longer dungeons, and maybe 15 to 20 max for bosses like Praetor Mako or Queen Calypso, where you can just fight them immediately, because 45 is just kind of insane by comparison. I had really hoped that with the addition of a pity system for the Atavistic gear, that it might pave the way for other pity systems to be added in the future, like for Waterworks, Zigzag, or Darkmoor. But if this is going to be the way it's implemented, then it's not really a great change. For the viewers out there, definitely let the devs know your feedback on this, because there's a chance we could get them to reduce the badge requirements, but at present I can't really recommend farming for stuff like the hats, robes, or boots, which is a bummer because they are oftentimes a pretty decent upgrade to other gear options at this level. Alright, my fellow wizards, those were the two big updates included in this patch. Let me know in the comments what you think of the new spells and pity system. I'd love to hear more people's thoughts on how the new weakness spells might be used in PvP, advanced content, or spell weaving in particular. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, as it really does help me to make more amazing Wiz content for you all. And if you want to support me and the channel further, you can hit the join button below to become one of my awesome channel members. As always, I hope to see you out there in the spiral, and happy questing!